Our prayer this morning is by Audette Fulbright Fulson. Did you rise this morning, broken and hung over with weariness and pain and rage, tattered from waving too long in a brutal wind? Get up, child. Pull your bones upright. Gather your skin and muscle into a patch of sun. Draw deep breaths into your lungs. You will need it, for another day calls to you. I know you ache. I know you wish the work were done, and you, with everyone you have ever loved, were on a distant shore, safe and unafraid. But remember this, tired as you are not alone. Here and here and here also, there are others weeping and rising and gathering their courage. You belong to them, and they to you. And together we will break through and bend the arc of justice all the way down into our lives. Amen. So for our reading this morning, I wanted to tell you a story. I thought I'd come down here to do this. I've seen other preachers do it and thought I'd give it a try. So this is a true story. Now, most of you have heard me talk about Star Island before. It is one of my favorite places in the world. It's a little tiny island off of the coast of New Hampshire, and it's owned by the Unitarian Universalists and the UCCs, and they offer conferences there throughout the summer. So you can go for a week on a certain theme and live on this tiny island with no cars and no distractions, and it's wonderful. Well, the conference that I grew up going to was the youth conference, and I went there all through my teenage years and in through college, and it was wonderful. And when you get to be college-aged, they let you kind of lead the conference. So by the time I was a freshman in college, I was one of the sort of camp counselors. And the first year that I was a camp counselor, we had a young woman register who was deaf. And she was about 15 years old. Her name was Emily. And she registered even though she didn't have a translator to come with her to the island. She showed up on that first day at the dock with a pad of paper and a pen. And I was at the registration table, and I knew that we had this deaf conferee enroll, and so when she came to the dock registration table, I signed to her, H-I, hi. And years later she told me, you know, I've never seen anyone spell out the word hi before. She said, usually they just sign hi. But it did make her feel more welcome on that day. So that year, we made do with a pad and a pen and writing everything down for her, and she would write back to us. And when I went back to school that year, I told my Unitarian Universalist minister, who I loved, Reverend Stan Sears, I said, it was such an amazing experience, but I wish I could communicate with her in sign language. And I also told him that my university had no sign language classes amongst all their language classes. And he was a terrific minister. And he took it upon himself to call around, and he found an adult education class in sign language for me. And they had already started, so he got special permission for me to enroll late. And so the next week I started, in addition to my university classes, to go every week downtown for American Sign Language classes at the Adult Ed Center. And so the next year at Star Island, I was able to sign a little bit with Emily. And you know, I wasn't the only one who had had that idea. Several other campers had gone home and enrolled in sign language classes. And so there was a small group of us signing with her, and we were learning more signs from her every day. At this point, she's a 16-year-old girl, so our vocabulary was kind of limited to a teenage girl's vocabulary, but it was growing every day. And by the third year, at the end of every meal table, there was a little group using sign language. And one day, one of the teenage boys came up to me, and he said, "I really hate it how everyone's using sign language now. I really feel excluded because I don't know what you're saying, and I don't think it's fair." And I took a deep breath, and although I didn't have a ton of patience for him, I did bring that word back to the other camp counselors and said, "People are feeling this way, what should we do?" So we decided that we would have little workshops every day on sign language on the island, and people who were feeling frustrated could come and learn a few words, and then maybe they would feel more engaged. So the next day, we had a workshop on the porch overlooking the ocean, and a group came, and it was fabulous. You know who didn't come, though? That teenage boy. He didn't want to put a lot of effort into being included. He just wanted that to be how it was, without effort. So I'm going to come back to this story in the sermon, but I want to start you thinking about this theme of inclusion and exclusion and when you might have felt excluded in your life. Now, I'm still riding on a high from yesterday. Yeah. I was in Boston at the Women's March, and it was incredible. I know some of you were with me, some of you were here in Provincetown marching, and some of us are still on a bus with no bathroom riding back from Washington, D.C. Although you made it, they're here. These are the no bathroom bussers. Woo! And they're still here. I love their commitment. Over 150,000 people turned out to march in Boston yesterday. We thought the biggest march was in D.C. with an estimated 500,000, but in L.A., an unexpected 750,000 people showed up. But here's what's even more incredible. There were 673 sister marches across the United States and all around the world, almost 5 million people marching. The Women's March vision is this: we stand together in solidarity with our partners and children for the protection of our rights, our safety, our health, and our families, recognizing that our vibrant and diverse communities are the strength of our country. It's a beautiful vision statement. And all people were invited to march, regardless of gender or gender identity. All people who believe that women's rights are human rights were invited to march. And still, I heard some people ask, why a women's march? Isn't that exclusive? It's the same kind of question I've been hearing a lot of lately, especially in the online forums I am part of. This question of inclusivity and exclusivity has been knocking on my door over and over this winter. In one professional group I am in, the women recently created a separate online chatting space just for women. Some of the men were put out. Isn't that sexism, they asked, excluding men based on their gender? They were mad that they would no longer be included in all our conversations, and I think they feared we were talking about them. I assure you, we had better things to talk about. In another group, someone posed a question for just LGBT folks to answer, and someone asked, I wonder how the straight people on this list feel about being asked not to comment. I mean, they are strong LGBT allies, and they've been working for gay rights too. And my most painful online interactions of late have occurred in a group that used to be the bright spot of my days, an online group of over 3 million called Pantsuit Nation. Have you heard of it? It It began as an incredible forum for sharing stories of women and others who were excited to elect a female president. People shared stories of their grandmothers who were born without the right to vote. They lifted up their suffragette ancestors, their strong single-parent mothers who put food on the table, their beautiful daughters who were growing up believing that they could be anything they set their mind to. And then the conversation expanded to interracial families and people of different physical abilities chiming in about their life experiences. Gay couples started posting pictures of their weddings, and trans folks added their voices. It was an amazing forum for sharing stories of standing up to bigotry and bullying. During a difficult time, I found solace and support and hope there. To me, it was a utopian community, representative of what our country could be. When I was tired, it reminded me what I was fighting for. But then, instead of fighting for each other, we began fighting with each other. As more and more people started sharing stories of encountering racism, there began to be some division in the group. The point of this group isn't to talk about racism, some people began saying. And when one person of color posted her experience and asked for only other people of color to respond, some of the white women on the list got angry. They didn't like being asked to stay quiet. They felt excluded. They said, "Isn't that racism?" Again, the knocking. The question of inclusion and exclusion was beating at my door, asking me to open it, invite it in, sit on the couch with me. But I didn't want to. The question makes me tired. Just after Christmas, I went to visit my 96-year-old grandmother. She's in a nursing home and isn't quite all there anymore. Mostly she doesn't know who I am. So it's probably a little unfair to use her as an example here. But as my nephew John always says, don't tell Aunt Kate, she'll put it in a sermon. Anyway, I was visiting my grandmother just after Christmas, and I had just given her a blanket for a present. And it was probably our best interaction in years, even though she didn't really understand who I was. And I asked her, "Did they do anything special here for Christmas?" And she said, "No, they didn't do anything for Christmas. It was all Jewish. It was very confusing." Now, because I am a critical thinker, and because I had just walked past 1 million Christmas decorations on my way in, my assessment of the situation was that they probably had put up one electric menorah at the nursing home. And maybe there had been a little ceremony for the first night of Hanukkah, amongst all the Christmas carols and the Christmas brunch and the Christmas tree and all the wreaths hanging everywhere. But my grandmother didn't connect with the menorah, so somehow its presence bothered her and made her feel like nothing was being done for Christmas. And I was reminded of the quote, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression." I'm going to say that again because it's important. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. It's a lot to take in, I know. But dig in here with me, won't you? When you are a straight person in a predominantly GLBT congregation, and you occasionally find yourself thinking, where are all the people like me? Equality might feel like oppression. When you are a man asked to take a supporting role in a women's march led by women, equality might feel like oppression. When you are a cisgendered person and you are asked at a meeting to introduce yourself using your name and the pronouns you prefer, equality might feel like oppression. When you are asked to use language and phrases that don't offend people and you feel worn down by the politically correct police, equality might feel like oppression. When you hear happy holidays and you interpret that as a war on Christmas, equality might feel like oppression. When you hear there is a lesbian business owners group starting in your town and you are not a lesbian, equality might feel like oppression. When you see a banner above the door of your church that says Black Lives Matter, and you see the invisible word only instead of the invisible word to, then equality might feel like oppression. It might feel like that, but it's not. And it's our job when we are feeling that way, because those feelings will come and there is nothing wrong with that. But it's our job when we are feeling that way to question those feelings. You know, I realize that sometimes my messages to you might seem contrary. One week I preach about the value of being quiet, and the next about raising our voices for justice. One week I preach about the art of waiting, and the next about the power of now. This month in the newsletter, I talked about being aware of our fragile places. I talked about protecting those places where we feel most tender, about putting a Pyrex baking dish over our vulnerabilities to protect ourselves. Well, today I'm asking you something a little different. Not contrary exactly, but certainly nuancing that assignment about protecting ourselves. Today, I'm asking us to poke at our fragility and to examine it and to separate it into feelings that truly need protecting and feelings that shouldn't be protected. Because our fragility due to privilege is not something we are called to protect as a spiritual community. It's something we are called to dismantle. When we feel excluded, it feels awful. I know that. And sometimes the faithful response is to fight our way in, to be counted, to be included. But not always. And it's very, very important to think about the differences between when to fight for inclusion and when to step back and step out of the center, to let others have the space that we have been occupying without even knowing it. I titled today's sermon, "No Girls Allowed in the Clubhouse." And I want to say that as a girl growing up, I would have been really mad if I saw a sign like that. But as an adult, I would have to nuance my reaction a little bit. Why are no girls allowed in the clubhouse? Is it because girls aren't cool and can't climb trees and can't do math and don't like trucks? Well, no. I'd fight for my right to be in the clubhouse. But is it because the 12-year-old boys in the clubhouse need some time and space by themselves to process puberty? To figure out what is going on with their changing bodies in a safe setting? Then you know what? I support that space for them. Maybe we can create another equally awesome clubhouse for girls, or an intentionally open clubhouse for boys and girls and kids that don't particularly identify with either of those genders. The point is to ask ourselves when we are feeling excluded, Why is this separate grouping needed? What purpose does it serve? And who is asking for it? There will be times when we need to break down the walls of separation and demand inclusion. And there will be times when we need to decenter ourselves, offer ourselves up as allies, and see how we can be of support to the group from the outside. Or just step away, trusting that a need that we may not even understand is being met. You know, back on Star Island, I asked that teenage boy to try the same thing that I ask of you now. To use all of your feelings as a tool. Take that knowledge of what it feels like to be excluded and use it to imagine what various minority communities might feel like all the time. If you are a hearing person who feels excluded by the use of sign language, for example, think about how that feels. You feel outside of things. You don't know what is being said. You worry that they might be signing about you, but there's no way to know. You feel like you don't have the same skills as everyone and you're at a disadvantage. You don't know how to make inroads into that group, and you feel isolated. Now that you are in touch with those emotions, take a few minutes to feel deep empathy for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. Imagine how outside of things they must feel. Now come back to you for a minute. What was once a liability, your own negative feelings about being left out of a circle of people communicating through sign language, is now a strength. The strength of deep empathy. You can now imagine how a deaf person might be feeling in a hearing community, and you can use that strength to reach out to those who can't hear or to include those who are hard of hearing. You can make adjustments to your own way of communicating that might be more inclusive. At the next meeting you are at, when someone says, "Oh, I don't need the microphone, I'm loud, I can project," you can gently interrupt them to say, "Actually, it would be really helpful if you do use the microphone. It's so much easier for those who are hard of hearing to hear an amplified voice. And some of us are actually using hearing devices that are looped into our sound system. So thank you for using the microphone." At General Assembly last year, my colleague, Reverend Nancy McDonald Ladd, wowed the gathered stadium of people with her sermon about fake fights. She said that sometimes fake fights conceal and take energy away from the actual fights that we are needing to have. A fake fight about the bylaws in the annual meeting conceals a real fight about the values that undergird our history coming into relationship with the values that may undergird our future. She said, "We duke it out over the paint color in the bathroom instead of seeing the pastoral window into the inner life of one whose voice in the world seems increasingly powerless." And all lives matter, she says. Yes, that one, chief among the fake fights and cover conversations that distract from the work at hand, is not about the slogan. More often than not, she says, it's about our deep and abiding resistance to actually taking on the systemic white supremacy that eats at the heart of us and our culture. But Nancy and the collective wisdom of the ages remind us that the stakes are high, and the ultimate prize we must reach out for in community is greater than the imagined divisions and trumped-up arguments that pull us apart. And here's a segue in Nancy's sermon that you won't see coming. You know, in WrestleMania, she says, when professional wrestlers have those fake fights, sometimes they're really at risk of getting hurt. And you know what they do before the muscle snaps or the bones break in that fake fight? They tap out. They bang the mat. When the fake fight gets close to having real consequences, they tap out. I tell you what, Nancy says, I'm tapping out right now, and I invite you to join me. I'm tapping out of every fake fight in our congregations and our movement about getting what I want or what you want or what we think we want, because the stakes are too high and we don't have time for fake fights anymore. The real conversations are waiting, she says. Just beneath the surface of the fake fight is the actual encounter, soul to soul and hand to hand, in which change is possible. So let's have that conversation, the real one, the hard one, the one that requires us to keep showing up, and let's do it with edge and forgiveness, calling out and calling in, calling forth a new kind of community, both in our congregations and in the world. Did you know that 62 people in this world hold the same amount of wealth as half the world's population? The bottom 3.6 billion people, 62 people hold the wealth of half the world. That sounds like a real fight to me. So today, inspired by Nancy's words, I am inviting us to tap out of the fake fights about exclusivity and to get into the ring for the real struggle for justice. Amen, and blessed be.